I want to welcome you back to another episode of what I've branded pivotal, since these interview style segments tackle impactful CPG industry topics and lessons from the business leaders that live it every day. My guest on this episode is an absolute rock star. Before becoming the chief digital officer at one of my favorite digital first CPG brands, HighKey, Ryan Rouse was the co founder of the meal delivery company Factor that sold to HelloFresh for almost $300 million. We cover a crucial story at the end of our conversation about how that exit event brought Ryan zero monetary value. Ryan also shares his thoughts about the changing role of the chief marketing officer inside of the CPG industry. And additionally, we talked about how arbitraging and mediocrity will no longer cut it when you're trying to grow through the e commerce channel. These are just some of the interesting topics we covered in this episode, but without further delay, here is my recent conversation with the chief digital officer at HighKey, Ryan Rouse. So, welcome to the show, Ryan. Appreciate it for you joining me.
Thanks, bud. Yeah, happy to be here.
And I hate to, I feel like when I say show, that's always like the word I use, but and it gives off this like for me like I'm faking it till I'm making it type of thing in my head for whatever reason. But it's really just like two people jamming about shit that we're passionate about, and like anybody that's like watching or listening to this is they get to be the fly on the wall. So hopefully we can kind of dig into some nuggets of information for those flies on the wall that they can kind of take into their business and kind of make some value. But super excited to be chatting with my guest for several reasons. Ryan, you've quickly become one of my favorite people on LinkedIn to follow. I think a lot of the stuff that you post is super impactful, super relevant. It just the way you write it is definitely something that just reaches me and kind of I think it would reach a lot of people. So if you're not following Ryan, I think you definitely should do that. Also, you're part of I think for me one of the most successful and most impressive like digital first emerging CPG brand in the food space right now with HighKey. I think like if anybody wants to look at a business and definitely see some really great strategies and tactics, I think you guys are probably one of the businesses to pay attention to. And you're a Midwest guy that studied finance, and people are going to laugh because I feel like I maybe cherry pick these Midwesterners that studied and worked in finance and then transitioned into CPG. But I swear to God, like I don't know a lot of times until I'm doing background right before the show that like this is the case. And maybe they're attracted to me or maybe I'm attracted to them, but like naturally it kind of happens. But this kind of brings up at least like a surface question to
Yeah.
transition this conversation, and that is like what caused that switch to go off in your head from maybe like a finance and sales role to like a marketing role in consumer companies?
Yeah, so much by mistake. So I'm in finance, working for Merrill Lynch. I got a job with Merrill Lynch in 2006 in New York City. Grew up in Chicago, as you alluded to, in the suburbs of Chicago. But that's my big break in my head, anyway. Right? Big firm, go to Wall Street. I'm gonna make it big. And I end up working at the redheaded stepchild of the financial crisis during the financial crisis, which is just a wild experience. I could go on and on with all the stories I have from there, but it's really interesting experience. I think I always knew. I can't say that I deliberately was like, oh, finance is a place, finance slash sales, and the combo of those is a place where I can go make really good money for a period of time and then move on from it. That is not, I was not that thoughtful about it. But I think if you were to ask me back then, I knew that staying in finance and sales wasn't going to be the long haul for me. What was next, I couldn't have said what it was until it was next. So it wasn't a very deliberate move, but the reality was there was an opportunity to make good money in finance and something that I thought I was good at, both sales, the mix of sales and finance. And then in 2013, my buddy from college came to me with the idea for a prepared meal delivery company, which ended up being Factor. His idea, he turned to paleo eating, liked it, couldn't find anywhere where he could get a healthy meal really conveniently. So he came to me and he said, "Hey, I'm looking for a co-founder to help me launch this business. I'm at an inflection point in my life where I sort of knew I didn't want to do what I was doing. I didn't know what I wanted to do next, and very ignorantly just said, 'Sure, I'll do it.'" I knew nothing about marketing at the time. Him and I really knew nothing about anything that we were getting into, which is really, really stupid move to get into. Like a lot of ignorance has to come with starting a business, but we didn't bring any skill sets. I think a lot of times, let's just say I had a background in marketing, which I didn't, and he had a background in food operations. Okay, cool. There's a couple of like important functions that we have an understanding of coming into the business. We knew nothing about any of it. So wasn't like, hey, let me go into marketing and CPG. It was we launched a brand with our own using a lot of our own money, and we kept running through marketing agencies and marketing personnel, and they weren't working. And they weren't not working because of them. They were not working because of us. We didn't know enough about it. So at the time, I decided to just immerse myself in the world of marketing and learn marketing so that I could manage the function so that we could grow the business. So it was, I mean, it was all by mistake, without a doubt.
Now, with that kind of background of sales, and being a revenue generating kind of person and key in the company, and then now with what's kind of like the changing role of the CMO, do you think that has kind of given you a really good core for like what's next with like CMOs in general right now, or just like marketing functions?
I do think so. I think that I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know what e-commerce was or growth marketing, and those things maybe weren't even prominently said back in 2013, 14. I knew that we had to grow the business, and I needed to learn a lot about advertising and email and copy and persuasion and things like that. That's now morphed into what sort of the traditional growth marketing role is, but at the time, that wasn't what was going through my head. I definitely needed to grow a business, and my entire background was in sales, which was you eat what you kill. There's a number to go get, you have to go get it. So the strategy was the same as I stepped into leading the growth function of Factor. The tactics were different, so I had to learn a lot of tactical stuff. But yeah, I think if you think about the fact that especially in food and beverage and in CPG, um, the e-com function is a lot more of a sales function than it is a brand marketing function. I do think that set me up very well just in mindset and strategy and how I would think about going and attacking the role. I think to your broader question and point is, yeah, I think that you're seeing a lot of brands now sort of name a VP of brand or a chief brand officer. And that person that's in charge of brand has a lot of the responsibilities that CMOs of the past or VPs of marketings of the past had. So you've got this, I think, transitionary period where the marketing role, traditional marketing role 20 years ago and beyond that was all brand creative messaging. And then in the interim, it's been both for those that could really take that on, both growth marketing and brand marketing. And it certainly seems to me that the transition is going towards maybe a laid out brand role, and that marketing is taking on, certainly in CPG, marketing is taking on the role of maybe more of a sales function, more of a tighter revenue function than it did in the past. And that the brand role, which is still hyper important and critical for any business, stands on its own. And I think it's probably a good sort of bifurcation of those two.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think that we were up until maybe this is still kind of happening, but I definitely think a few years ago, the marketing person, if that's the CMO, the highest, like they were tasked to continue to do the most traditional senses of marketing, and then learn this new performance growth side that maybe was not something that they knew much about, and they struggled to kind of understand how to tackle both of those. And if they weren't, I guess, strong or had a core understanding of the growth side, they were hiring out a bunch of really strong people in that area. And then as things shifted towards, Facebook and all that, I think that became such a more important role, or just a way that people saw a quicker growth trajectory, or just an easier build process. And it really muddled all the things together. And a lot of those core functions of marketing, for whatever reason, like started to fall to the wayside for more of the growth perspective. And now I think it's coming a little bit full circle, where a lot of those maybe I don't want to call them like cheat codes or whatever they are. I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's arbitraging things. Like a lot of that's closing.
Yep.
So then it goes back to like, do you understand the fundamentals?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, I guess in my head, maybe this is very self-serving, but whatever, right? Like I do think that it's important to be balanced on both in marketing, and that neither side is good. To only view the marketing function as brand and creative, or on on the other end of the extreme, to only view it as performance and growth marketing, sells the other one completely short. And one needs to, it's a symbiotic relationship between the two. So I think you're right. I wouldn't fault anyone who has been in a marketing leadership role that doesn't have a strong background in performance or digital or ecom, because they wouldn't have had the trajectory growing up. If you're a CMO 5 years ago, you wouldn't have, ecom and performance marketing wasn't really a big thing on their way up into that seat. So I think it's just a total transitionary period. But yeah, I think you absolutely have to have a strong background and understanding of both. I love that I have a sales background, because that has allowed me to be strong in the performance side of things. And then building a brand on my own forced me to be strong on the brand side of things. I still think if I had to put pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses, I'm still much stronger on the growth and performance side than I am on the brand side. But it's been a muscle I've had to flex, and I'm glad that I've had to. But certainly, if I'm ever stepping into a role, I'm much more able to handle the performance marketing side without maybe a right or left hand on that side. But I would need someone on the strong and brand as a right or left hand, to really help me drive that eats, sleeps, and breathes that side of the business.
Now, at HighKey, you guys, I mean, and you've been on that role now for, I think, what, a year or
A
so?
year. Yep.
And like people that maybe don't know HighKey, like, I mean, super strong in Amazon. I think the founder of it, AJ Patel, like he's super big on building Amazon brands. I think he was a part of Zesty Paws, and a couple other brands in my specific space and supplements, I think, as well with the Amazon that he's built. Um, and I'm curious, coming in, and a lot of times I wouldn't say that CPG, at least at the beginning, they don't have a good relationship with direct to consumer, and they don't have a good relationship maybe even with Amazon. But for whatever reason, a lot of maybe newer brands, I think, lean way far into direct to consumer, and they discount or maybe look down on Amazon as, this key part of acquisition of a customer. And I think you shared a story that resonated with me, because it's something that happens in my life pretty much, almost every week with my wife or me, is that, we'll come across a brand, we'll search for that brand. The first time we search for that brand is that we go on Amazon. And if that brand is not on Amazon, or the product that we're looking for is not on Amazon, we probably don't buy that product. We don't go the steps further to like look at their direct to consumer, figure out where else they're at or whatever. And that consumer journey, I think, is something that's like super important. And I think that at HighKey, you guys have been really great at understanding how to use Amazon effectively, but also how to make direct to consumer different, that it's still unique. So maybe you could talk through like how you guys approach those two and how they work together. And because I think a lot of times people, for whatever reason, like think about those as like cannibalizing each other. And maybe they do if you don't have the right strategies, but I think you guys do a really great job at making each one special.
Yeah. Yeah. So many conversations baked into that. Listen, I think at the end of the day, a consumer packaged goods brand, a food and beverage brand, in order to win long term and take market share, you need to be omni-channel. And I don't really love the term omni-channel. I prefer multi-channel, but I think you have to be in retail, brick and mortar eventually. Timing is, I think, the big consideration on when you enter each of those, right? And that depends a lot on capabilities, cash, experience of the team, so on and so forth. But I think the end game has to be multi-channel. You're in retail, you're on Amazon, you're on your own website. And it's very interesting. I just think a lot of the discourse that's out there, you saw a lot of brands that were able to come digitally native, Warby Parker, Dollar Shave Club. You got a lot of these brands that like really paved the way for D2C first. different environment at the time, very different environment. So I don't think it's apples to apples, but what that put, I think, in a lot of people's heads is that they should be direct to consumer first and only, or that they could be, or that that's some path. Because like a lot of things that happen in the market, then that becomes held up on a pedestal, and then the Me Too I shouldn't use, but like, the
Yeah.
copycat movement starts to come around and say, hey, we're going to replicate the success of some of these other brands, right? And so it's very interesting to me that you do have a lot of people out there who, yes, who um, have a deep affinity that they only want to do one thing or the other, whether that's only want to do Amazon or only want to do direct to consumer or only want to do retail. And I think the sequencing and timing of when you get into each channel is hyper important. I do not want to discount that, but I don't understand how you wouldn't just want to eventually be on all channels that generate a lot of business for food and beverage brands. And that's Amazon. That's certainly Amazon and retail. If you can create your own direct to consumer experience, by all means, there's a hell of a lot of pros and benefits to that. But yeah, so that's my general sort of thesis on how I think things are going. Now you talk about on a brand specific level, how did we do it? We certainly were digitally native, but we were Amazon digitally native. And if you know how to work within the Amazon ecosphere, which we've got an amazing Amazon team, and people and capabilities on that front, which many don't. So we're working at an advantage that most people don't have the luxury of being able to have. Then I think it's as effective as you could do on direct to consumer when launching a business, because what you're talking about is fast iteration cycles. So we launched on Amazon. We're able to bring products to market that didn't have to be perfect because we didn't have to sell our retail buyer on them. We could bring them to market. We could get feedback. We could get reviews. We could get that feedback cycle that could go back into um, reforming the product if necessary, figuring out who our customer was, and take that then to buyers. Take that then into omni-channel. I think you can do that on either channel. You could do that on D2C. You could do that on Amazon. I think there's pros and cons to doing that on either one of those channels. But I don't understand people's mindsets of like deeply loving one over the other. I just think they're channels and they have pros and cons. And we could go into conversation on conversation of what the pros and cons of each of them are, but that's what they are. They're channels. They have pros and cons. We were able to leverage Amazon. I think leveraging an online channel, either D2C or Amazon, has a ton of benefits in the early stages of a brand to do all the things I just said. Figure out who the customer is, get a feedback cycle, get some customer information, get some sales data that you can then bring to a buyer and have more leverage with them. And then the end goal should be multi-channel distribution on the products that make the most sense, where you can tell a buyer, hey, look at all this traction that we've gotten online. Now we're at a point where a little bit more mature of a business, still in the early stages, but I think you do have to have a differentiation between those channels if you expect to drive business on both of those channels. So the way that we've thought about it is, we're in club, so we're in Costco, Sam's, BJ's, we're in traditional retail on all the major distributors or retailers, Target, Walmart, Kroger, Whole Foods. And then obviously you've got Amazon, we've got D2C, we've got some other third-party marketplaces. Where you can differentiate between the two, I think is important. And so for the way that I've thought about direct to consumer relative to Amazon is, and this is an ever shifting, changing environment, right? But up until this point, I think we drive a lot of trial on Amazon. I think similar to way that um, the club channel, Costco, brings a lot of times people who maybe never tried the brand before, or do know the brand and want to bulk up. That's how club is to retail, where retail maybe is driving a lot of trial. Club then is driving a lot of loyalty in the brick and mortar world. I see the same as how we're viewing HighKey on online, where I think Amazon for us drives a lot of trial. It also drives a lot of loyalty. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. But if you find our brand anywhere and you have an affinity for us, and now you want to get value by bulking up and buying a lot, that's how I see D2C. Our direct to consumers, where you can get the best value as long as you buy a lot of stuff. You can get bundles that you can't get elsewhere. And you can get, obviously get on our email list. You can do a lot of things where we can build the relationship between the brand and us. But that's how I viewed it to this point.
And I think that's a good way to approach it because I think with Amazon, and you kind of did a really good job, I think, at comparing that to traditional retail. I think it's a point where somebody's looking to buy, they're looking to probably trial something new. They want to, check something out on Amazon. It's great for non-branded search terms and the social proof system and everything, that people can get to a product that is mostly going to meet what they're looking for from purchase criteria. After that time, they buy it maybe again, or maybe they try a different SKU from your guys' brand. They start to love the brand. Then they're going to look at this and say, okay, is this a category that I love? And if I do love it, do I want to have a personal relationship probably with the brand in that category? And if they make that decision, then it's that time to probably go over to your direct-to-consumer experience and either buy in bulk, or, like you said, sign up for marketing things, try to make sure that you're a part of the brand. They want you to know who they are. They want to interact some way. They want to be able to get some value out of that relationship, and they make that transition. But the Amazon, I think, has its own advantages as well, to your point, because, when you are starting up, there's so many things that you can do on that platform, from testing, that you really, I think, cannot be unmatched anywhere else. And I think that, you can argue you can do those things on direct to consumer, but I don't think at the speed and at the volume of like people coming over to the listings that maybe wouldn't normally come over to a website, that you are able to really refine your brand before you take it and move it on to these different channels, or you look at different packaging, you look at different product iterations, you look at whatever. And maybe what scares people sometimes, and for me, probably comes down to category, is that when you do build in public, like on Amazon, there's a lot of white label or private label people that will jump into things. Now, the harder it is to manufacture those products, the more moat, I guess, you have from these private label or white label people. Because if you're selling like, a fat burner on there for supplements, like you can contact, dozens of contract manufacturers that will white label you something and get you 12 units tomorrow. But there aren't the same things if you want to do small, crunchy cookies. It takes a little bit of, I guess, lift for somebody to go around and try to figure out who can make this product, what's the minimum order quantity, and that turns off all those people. So, I think it's important probably to have a defensible product category if you are going to like really build, at least initially, on Amazon, because you are going to be open to people coming in and saying, oh, there looks like there's some traffic and some sales conversion. I'm going to, replicate that as quick as possible. So I think AJ or whoever was a part of the company when they first were starting this, I mean, I think he knows that stuff inside and out. So it's not, there's a reason why HighKey was built probably the way it was built. But I think there's a lot of lessons in the nuance, I think, of like what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, listen, there's been an opportunity over the last 10 years to build what many would call an Amazon business or an FBA business, a highly commoditized, grab market share on a tent, a camping tent, right? Find the search volume that's got a lot of search volume and not a lot of competitors, bring a product to market that's the same or slightly better than what's already out there. That is very challenging to bring off of Amazon, but you can do well on Amazon. Most of my content, all of my experience comes in the form of differentiated brands. And then now we're talking about which channel we should use to distribute those brands. So I think they're two very different conversations at the end of the day. But you're absolutely right. I think what's lost a lot of times, even when you're talking about private label and white label. Um, Retailers, the largest retailers in the world, all have private label brands, right? Like Kirkland is Costco's. Kirkland is a massive private label brand. They are also looking at what's working in their stores and then bringing to market a version that they have themselves, just like people's fears of Amazon doing that to them or other third party sellers doing it to them. So I think that competition element of it is going to exist everywhere. I think what you're saying is absolutely right. Differentiated product with some level of moat or multiple levels of moat, I think is absolutely important to bring to market. So you have to have that no matter what. And so just that argument of like, oh, Amazon's going to come steal your product, like that just is business and capitalism. So that's happening no matter what. And you just have to be cognizant of that. I think from the Amazon perspective, especially early on, what you were hitting on, at least I think, is complexity. Like you have, in terms of pros and cons, you have the ability to reduce some complexity of bringing a product to market by using Amazon. In other words, you don't have to deal with customer service. You don't have to deal with fulfillment. Those are two majorly complex functions within an early stage business. When you have two or three or four or five people trying to do every single function, those are time consuming, they're complex. And so if you can get rid of those, you can reduce the complexity inside the business. I also think from a marketing perspective, the Amazon ecosphere, marketing ecosphere is challenging. So I'm not saying it's easy. We're talking about in relation to the D2C marketing ecosphere, and it's a bit easier. It's a bit simpler than D2C, right? And lastly, the trust element of Amazon. If you've got Amazon PDPs converting at 10 to 20% and D2C stores converting at 1 to 2%, that in an advertising environment where you could get clicks for 50 cents or a dollar didn't matter. Now it matters heavily when you're paying $3 or $4 a click. So again, that's reducing complexity of having to solve for conversion rate optimization. So again, I love D2C. It's where I cut my teeth. It's where I learned this game. And I think we could go into all the benefits of what D2C offers, because I think it brings a ton as well. But that's what you're just saying. I think in the early stages, as simple as possible, earn complexity is something I always like to say. If you can earn complexity, that means you've solved simple. And in the early stages, the simpler the better, because everyone's over their skis all the time. And so to the extent that you can just reduce the complexity level, I just think it gives you a distinct advantage.
Another thing you kind of mentioned is around have your experience and focus on, differentiated brands. And I know for me, we talked, I think, around maybe the what, or like the product. And I think that is like the great product. I say this a lot, so people probably think I'm a broken record, but I always say that a great product is just the entry fee to compete in the market today. It's really the deeper strategic alignment, the purpose, the things like that ultimately make the difference between these businesses. And you've mentioned before around that brands need to have, a heartbeat, or they need to have a soul, or some type of core to them today to stand out. And I think that's another even differentiation point, or moat, I think, when you're bringing this from Amazon to other channels, or just building a brand in general. If you are going after a more premium product or customer, you need to have something much more than just a great product.
Yeah, I think yes. And you have to have a great product.
Yeah, yeah,
There's so many things that we all know to be true if we've been around over the last 10 years in this game, and that's that really cheap advertising environment, social media being new, and people being on social and being okay with ads being served to them. They were much more comfortable with it 10 years ago, 5 years ago than they are now. They sort of are immune to the ads or seeing through a lot of the ads. It allowed a lot of things that aren't going to work in a normalized environment to work. One, maybe not as good of a product. You absolutely have to have a great product in order to succeed over the long term. We're talking food and bev. So now you're talking about taste, has to taste good. You're talking a lot about ingredients and what's being used and what's not being used. But product has to be great. And I think you could get away with a not so great product. Every time I post about that on LinkedIn, I get people bringing up with the exception, not the rule, right? And
yeah.
and I think we're talking about launching a brand today and going forward. How can you succeed? And good luck without a good product. When again, cheap ad environment, online being sort of a novelty and new and exciting allowed you to get away with that no longer. And then I think you're absolutely right. A lot of the things that consumers care about, and I think more importantly, the consumers that are about to be the ones with all the discretionary income, the millennial generation, the one under mine and yours, care more than our generation, and certainly the generations older than us, about ingredients, sourcing, and then at the brand level, is there any sort of give back? What are their values as a company? Who does run this company, and what do they care about? Do they take a stance? Do they not take a stance? I'm not saying you need to do all those things. They're saying consumers care. The consumers you're about to have to go get, and because they're the ones that are going to have the money, the target customers, they care about a lot of those things. So, and I just don't think that used to be the case. You're talking about a lot of like when I was a kid, our parents were in an environment where all of this was very new. Mass produced food is very new, and what you got was what you got. You weren't able to look into the brand. They were all large, major brands, and they could have cared less. That's who they bought. And now, if you want to be a young challenger brand, then obviously the ethos of the company, the soul of the company is going to matter to the consumer. It's not the only thing that matters. I don't think they're making their decisions solely based on that, but it's part of the consideration process. So that's that's got to mean something to the brand, and that's again why it's just a more challenging environment now than it used to be. Not that I'm saying it's challenging to have a soul as a brand, but you didn't used to have to do that, and now you do. And how you sort of communicate that to consumers isn't the most straightforward thing.
Yeah, and I also think like right now, if we're talking about, June of 2022, and maybe there's, an impending recession, maybe there isn't, that, people are over-indexing or focusing so much on value, and they're focusing on wherever in terms of price, and they're focusing on, and they're taking their eye off the ball of like maybe the deeper why and the deeper purpose behind things. And I think there's a way to do both. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, I definitely think that people that are buying maybe value-oriented brands are less worried, or maybe it's not as high on the purchase criteria for them to worry about what's the why behind. Those are usually categories that they're not passionate about, that are just,
Yeah,
quick consumption decisions. They just decide. But even in your case, and you mentioned this earlier around like how you even approach like the direct to consumer website, is that you can still be a purpose driven, have some deeper whys behind that, more premium brand, but also have value oriented, price pack architecture type things that you put in play on your direct to consumer site, and you treat it as like, hey, we're going to have, some bundles or some multi packs or things like that that'll drive the value down from a cost side, that can be still available to people, but we're not going to take our eye off the ball on like the deeper why.
totally. That's such a good point that you make. It's someone I saw a post recently where someone is saying that they love to take people who've had experience in food and beverage. I stumbled into it, as I told you, by mistake. I have no idea. I've just stayed in food and beverage since then. I don't know how complex it is compared to other businesses. Business is complex in general, so don't mistake. We're talking about a scale of hard and like what's maybe a little bit easier, what's maybe a little bit more challenging. But they said they love taking people from food and beverage CPG brands because it's such a challenging, complex environment. So I really like that as an aside. But you hit on the head. Like, when you say something, it's not like that's the only thing that matters. You're talking food and beverage. Your product has to taste good, and there has to be some value proposition of the consumer. Certainly in a recessionary environment, but remove that. Absolutely, there has to be some value, even in a normalized environment or non-recessionary environment. So I think you're right. I say that thing about the complexity of CPG because it ties into this, like pack architecture, pricing architecture, value proposition. All of those things are not just, oh, the cheapest price. It's the value proposition when you buy a certain amount, or it could be the cheapest price at the lowest amount, but it's all really, really meaningful. So you can't bring a brand that's got the cheapest individual pack out there with the worst ingredients and win. And on the flip side, you can't just bring a brand that's got a great ethos and a great um, values, internal values, and be the most expensive and win, right? That all of these things are just talking about consideration sets inside of it. But you're right. At the end of the day, if you can't bring value relative to the marketplace and have something that tastes good, then you're not going to survive in food and beverage. That's just the cold reality of it.
I want to transition just for the last part of our conversation. And I tend to be like seeking out some of these like unique stories around like when you exit a business and things. And I talked to Barry Turner that founded Lenny and Larry's, and he talked about, how when he sold his business, it was kind of like one of the worst days of his life because of what does he do next? Like what's going on? He didn't think through that, some of those types of things. And I really enjoyed a story that you kind of shared around Factor, and we touched on it earlier that that was kind of, the transition. You had a great job at Merrill Lynch. You're making a ton of money and everything, and then all of a sudden you jump into this, entrepreneurship space where you didn't necessarily maybe know too much about what was going on, and you probably made decisions that were, less than, I guess, ideal if looking back, if you now knowing what you know now. And maybe you could share a little bit of that like kind of story, because I think it's one of those stories that like people need to hear, especially if they're thinking about starting their business, because I don't think it's a story that gets told very often.
Yeah, yeah. So, to your point, I'm with Merrill Lynch, doing well. Had I stayed in finance, I don't have to worry about money for the rest of my life. I wouldn't be flying around in jets by any means, but I would have taken care of myself and my family, presumably for the rest of my life. We transitioned to start a business. We use a lot of our own money to fund the business. I end up very deeply in debt. So emptied the 401k and sort of just went all in on the business because I felt like I needed to, and we felt like we were onto something. But to wrap it up, and then we can circle back. About 5 years into the business, I decided to leave the day to day because I was so far in debt and I wasn't having any fun, and it was so stressful. We were really starting to get a lot of momentum, which was great after a couple of early years where we struggled. Um, but not almost, I set myself up so the only way I was going to get out of debt was to have like a really large exit event. And you can't count on an exit event, right? Like many businesses you talk to that ended up having a large exit event, like Factor did, almost went under very soon before the exit event. Like called very soon, like a year or 2 years before, when everyone was like, "Oh, they're probably doing great." You can run out of money by not selling, and you can run out of money by selling too many things. Like, you can always run out of money inside of a business. So Factor, I leave the day to day. Factor a few years later goes on to have a large exit, $277 million. And I had sold all of my equity when I left the day to day. It's not what I wanted to do. There's a story behind that. But the only people, I was so far in debt and I needed some money to get myself out. I had a family then, I had 3 kids. I didn't have any kids when we launched the business. And I really felt like for my family, I had to get myself out of this predicament that I was in financially. I was trying to sell our equity to our existing investors. They didn't get me where I really wanted to go. I got one investor basically who said, "I'll give you all that you're looking for this price. It's an all or nothing deal. Take it or leave it." And I felt like I had to take it. So I did okay. I got out of debt, thankfully. Great. At the time, it's like, hey, you started a business, you ended up break even, slightly above. That feels like a victory. Factor goes on to have a massive exit. A lot of people made a lot of money, and I didn't make any. Those are my decisions, right? I own every single one of those decisions. Those are no one else's decisions. No one forced me into it. I decided to sell my equity, regardless of the story behind it, and I had my reasons for it. But it was very, very hard to deal with a company that, listen, you start a business and your intent is to build something that has this massive windfall and exit for you. That's why you do it. That we have a lot of integrity behind like wanting to bring prepared meals to market that had the highest quality ingredients. So there was a lot of passion behind it too, but you don't leave, and for me, you don't leave an industry where you're going to be set for life to not do something that makes money. But most brands that are built don't have a great exit. So we're in that 5%, maybe less, that actually have this great outcome. I felt like I had sacrificed a lot and that I had earned something from that, but I didn't, right? By the letter of the law, I did not. So I ended up getting, on the day of acquisition, I ended up getting $0 because I had zero equity. And a lot of other people ended up making a lot of money. But I mean, it's part of the learning process from, I will take the learnings from that with me for life.
Yeah, I don't think anybody can fault you for doing something that, was the best decision for your family. Like you said, I mean, maybe if you were, still a single guy or whatever, you made a completely different decision because you
Yeah.
didn't have to worry about feeding other mouths and making sure there was a roof over there, or, all that type of stuff. But that might be one of those cases where like it would definitely wreck them. But you've been able to take it and use it as like, I think, a force for good. But like you said, it taught you some things, and maybe you could throw out one or two things that maybe you would do differently, maybe, or whatever, or maybe what you've learned from it, because I think that there are probably other people that are in that situation now, or maybe going to be in that situation because they're going to be building a business now in a tight capital market,
Yeah.
that they're going to be looking at this and saying, okay, well, I have to use my own capital.
Totally. I mean, to your one point, my options are to sign up for a life of bitterness and feeling like I'm owed something that I never got, or I can choose the other route. I want to be happy in my life. That's my life goal. It's a moving target for everyone, and it's hard. But if I sit, that's not to say this hasn't been challenging. Still, some days it isn't challenging. But if you think you're owed something by the world that you didn't get, that's just a life of bitterness, and I'm trying very hard not to, and I think I'm doing a good job of not viewing it in that way. The one thing that I would say, like, that I would recommend to people is don't use your own money. If you do, to fund your own business. If you do, and you can get away with it, market as loans into the business. Because at the end of the day, I didn't take a salary, I didn't take $1 out of the business. I only put in for 3 years. All of the money, for the most part, that I put in was not loans that I could have then retrieved out. The equity that you earn is sweat equity by not taking salary and giving up the opportunity cost of another job in the marketplace and what you're worth. That should be worth equity. And if you're putting your own money in my opinion, that should be coded as loans in the business that the business owes you at the end of the day, so that you have your equity from the work that you're putting in. And then you have, if you're putting money in, that should be different. And for me, I put most of my money in just because we needed it. Wasn't smart enough to code them as loans. So now there were equity. And when I sold my equity, I had nothing. Versus I could have got the money out that I put in as loans, and I should have still had sweat equity that I put in for just not taking a salary for 3 years.
Yeah, I think that's a really great tip there. And I know you have a hard stop, so we could probably keep jamming about a bunch of different things. But I appreciate you giving me some of your time, Ryan, and definitely a lot of the insights that you shared. I think it's super valuable for people. So definitely appreciate it.
Thanks, bud. I really, really enjoyed it. Good to finally catch up with you, bud.
I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. If you did, consider hitting the like button to support me. Also, help me get to my short term goal of 2,000 subscribers by hitting the subscribe button. I'd love to see you join me on this journey, but we need to fix the fact that slightly less than 70% of you that are watching this YouTube video right now are not subscribed to my channel, and that makes me extremely sad. But I do want to thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.